Hi everyone, hope you're well. Karl and Thomas here from StoreHero. Want to record a quick video to hopefully give some context to a lot of brands who we've been speaking to and ultimately may not be over the next couple of weeks in what is otherwise a very busy time. A couple of questions we're getting consistently and some of the success calls we're having with StoreHero users. So we thought it'd be worthwhile getting together on a quick video and running through some of the key points. So here goes nothing. It might be a future career in podcasting, but we'll see how it goes. Maybe from your perspective, Thomas, it'd be great to get some perspective around what you're hearing from brands, around maybe some of their kind of key considerations for Black Friday and potentially why it's different from previous years. I know you would have seen a bit more of a unique look at this in Shopify, from your previous experience. So you have maybe a more unique angle than most as to how the process actually works from a tactical perspective on a day-to-day basis.
Yeah, I mean, look, coming to the end of October, start of November, it could be a scary time. Everyone's kind of got the October scaries, particularly in e-commerce. We go through 10 months of the year, kind of building up, planning for what is ultimately now one weekend of the year, and it can be terrifying. You buy in your inventory, you're getting your ads ready, you're kind of crafting your offers. Is it going to work? Is it not going to work? So it is a scary time for everyone, but it's also a really, really exciting time. 2023, no doubt about it, has been quite challenging for a lot of brands across the board. Probably more challenging than other years kind of gone by, I suppose. Couple of reasons for that. We're probably seeing ads are more expensive. I know I'm seeing that with a lot of people I'm talking to. I'm sure you're probably seeing the same, Karl, as well. Definitely poorer purchasing power from the consumer, probably as a result of rising inflation. People just haven't really the pockets that they might have had in the last couple of years, which is hitting every business, e-commerce, and I'm sure retail on the high street as well. And definitely, I suppose there's definitely more of a shift to brands looking at the profitability metrics, more so than I suppose growth at all costs, as they may have looked at in the past as well. So, yeah, I mean, everyone's probably looking forward to it with an excitement, but also probably a touch of apprehension and a bit of nerves as well. So, yeah, looking forward to the next month to see how it goes.
Yeah, it's an interesting one. Like, obviously, we're at the forefront of the conversations, I think, around this, around that shift from a revenue-based metrics to maybe profit-based metrics, and that kind of broader macro environment. While it might sound very up in the sky and not really resonant with a lot of brands on a daily basis, but there is a practical implication if businesses aren't, don't have the ability to access cheap capital. There's that kind of trickle down effect where customers are less inclined to maybe go into an overdraft if their kind of purchasing power is low. Businesses themselves maybe a little bit less engaged or encouraged to order as much stock in advance, and that has kind of a trickle down effect across their kind of supply chain. And all of those factors have meant a much bigger focus on profitability as a key metric for success, as compared to revenue based metrics, which don't ultimately tell the full picture. So with all that in mind, I suppose we're seeing a lot of brands looking to reassess what they actually want out of Black Friday. Whereas maybe in previous years, to touch on what might have happened there is, it's probably has always been the case to a certain extent that it's a busy time that you're kind of making decisions on a day to day basis. But realistically, it's only when the dust settles in January where you have a chance to do that bit of a post mortem, understand that the additional sales revenue that might have looked really good on a day to day basis actually impact the business through the lens of profitability, which again, maybe that wasn't necessarily the focus before, but very much is now. So as that becomes the new focus, I suppose the next question we're often talking to brands about is should they do in terms of setting goals? I suppose you have talked to a lot of brands about that kind of shift between profit versus sales. Kind of touched on it there briefly, but it's a little bit of a different paradigm.
Yeah, very, very different. I mean, just before we jump off that as well, I saw an interesting tweet during the week. It was basically saying how Meta ads have got so much more expensive, but the amount of people now advertising on Meta and the amount of consumers using Meta products on a daily basis, I suppose, I think there's over 2 billion globally now. It's almost becoming an indicator of economic success globally, which is very, very interesting to think about. So obviously the ads have got more expensive, and is it Meta's system? Is it not Meta's system? Or is it actually such a big representation of, I suppose, just economics globally at this stage that poor, more expensive ads just mean a poorer economy globally as well. So it's an interesting one to look at.
Yeah, definitely. Sure. Look, I think 2 billion people would be the world's biggest economy, if I'm not mistaken. So definitely enough of a sample size. Yeah, I suppose one of the pieces that you would have mentioned, I know in our discussions around, you know, how that might actually change, if depending on whether profit or sales is that kind of north star for yourself, what kind of potential strategies you're using, and I would guess that that would vary then on that basis.
Yeah, I mean, you're really trying to move away from just growth at all costs. What we probably would have seen in the last couple of years, a lot of e-commerce brands could become heavily dependent on external financing, kind of like you've touched on there a couple of minutes ago as well. So really just trying to move away from, like, a lot of brands come to us and they want to hit a certain sales target, and when you really dig into the nuts and bolts of it, they're really trying to hit a profit target, and that's kind of masquerading itself as we need to hit this sales target and then almost see what profit we can almost pull out of that. Whereas you almost retroactively apply that and say, okay, what profit target do I need based on your gross margins, based on your operational expenses? You can quickly work out what actually is the maximum amount of marketing budget that you can spend to still make sure that you hit that net profit target, and then see, okay, based on that, you're going to get a marketing efficiency ratio. Is that actually achievable or not? Is that trending towards what you've hit the rest of the year? If it is, great. You're probably going to be on track to maybe hit that profit goal that you wanted to. If it isn't, if it's way out of whack and your marketing efficiency now needs to double over Black Friday, or it needs to double or triple to hit the kind of profit goals that you've set out, maybe they're unrealistic. Maybe there's other things we need to look at in terms of site optimization, offer creation, bundling, and so on and so forth. So it's a real different, I think, approach brands are taking this year. They're really trying to, I suppose, pay that profit bill to some extent, and understand that before they map out all of their targets. So we're not just setting sales targets, we're also setting marketing targets, gross profit targets, contribution margin targets, and really just trying to, I suppose, make sure that if we have started to increase our operational expense costs over the last couple of years, that we're keeping a close eye on them. It obviously goes without saying, but every euro, pound, dollar, whatever it is that we save in operational costs is an extra dollar, pound, or euro in net profit. The same isn't the same. The same isn't can't be said. I mean, when we add that as a sales figure, I suppose. So if we get an extra dollar in sales, that's not an extra dollar in profit. But if we save that on the operational expense line of the P&L, that's all flowing directly to the net profit line.
Yeah, it's an interesting one as well because ultimately, I think what can often happen in different organizations is everyone has a slightly different mindset or frame of reference as to what they want to achieve. Even if there's an overarching goal set around revenue, profitability, whatever the case may be, everyone is going to have a slightly different nuance on that, and everyone is kind of challenging each other around, okay, here's the right tactics to choose, but they're all coming from a different North Star. Maybe the finance team are looking to maximize that net profit line at the end of the year. The marketing team want that ROAS to be as high as possible, and ultimately maybe the ecom team or director or management level are looking for that overarching sales goal as well. So
I
one
mean,
thing
that's been
that's yeah, go ahead.
it's been fine if you have VC money, but
Mm,
unfortunately, 99.99% of e-commerce companies, particularly in 2023, don't have the luxury of having VC money, and they do need to make sure that the profits are in line, I suppose. But in terms of, I suppose, looking at North Star goals, if you were to pick three or four that you think brands should be looking at on a weekly basis, monthly basis, what would you say?
definitely, yes. So I think it's a really interesting point, and even when we're speaking to brands, it's always worth just trying to get everyone consolidated, collectively tied down to one particular goal. So some of the ones that we could kind of see consistently across different users, and it's part of the recommendations we would make are, okay, number one, it might be maximizing absolute profitability. So you're saying, okay, that revenue number realistically, while it's important, I don't want to do anything that's going to do a disservice to my profit at the end of the year. So that has an implication logically on the kind of decisions I make. And paid advertising is probably one of the bigger ones because it's one of the most variable costs that we don't even treat as a variable cost. A change in your CPA can really make the difference between whether an order is loss making and requires a repurchase in order to get to break even, or alternatively, we're in a position whereby we're first order profitable and able to drive a positive margin even if they don't come back. So in that context, if the goal is to maximize absolute profitability, we want to keep our CPA as low as possible, and we want to keep our contribution margin as high as possible. So that contribution margin being your gross profit after your marketing expenses. So again, as I said, because it's not treated as a variable expense, gross profit can ultimately mask that ad cost and marketing cost overall, which is much more variable than your product cost, let's say, one, a way to think about it is if your product cost changed as much as your CPA in your ads, there would be riots in the streets. Like you wouldn't feel comfortable operating on a daily basis with that. So ultimately, as what as much as you can control the controllables, factor it into the calculation. So therefore, you're really clear on it as well. I'm sure you
So,
see the same with
so
that as well.
just to kind of summarize
Yeah,
on the max absolute profitability, we're looking to keep our CPA as low as possible and keep our contribution margin as high as possible. Um,
exactly. It's a definitely more
no
aggressive way to go
brainer.
about it. Yeah, exactly. It's all very simple when you said it out loud, but it is ultimately an aggressive solution because most people won't be willing to see their overarching sales dip because you're making a decision not to take those extra sales that might make the top line sales look good, but are ultimately unprofitable and are kind of blended out in the kind of fog over the course of kind of a busy sales period. So
Can we actually just
yeah,
explain that one a little
sure.
bit? 'Cause I think it's a really, really important one for brands to actually understand what we're actually talking about there. Because I think it's a really, really important point that we shouldn't just gloss over.
Yeah, definitely. So even in that context, let's say ultimately, if we're trying to look at those two sides, one piece that might be actually a beneficial way to explain this is maybe comparing what the goal of maximizing absolute profitability would be to maximizing sales volume, because this helps
Hmm.
really maybe highlight that. So if you're to maximize sales volume, you're ultimately willing to accept lower margin sales or lower margin orders, let's say, with the goal of driving that overarching sales number up. So oftentimes when it comes to your CPA, you're going to allow for a little bit of a higher CPA because you're capturing sales that in the maximize profitability mindset or hat you're wearing, you're maybe going to avoid them. But in this context, you're willing to actually take those on. Now, from there, on the contribution margin basis as well, you're ultimately make a decision to say, my contribution margin, again, that gross margin after your marketing costs, is also going to be a bit lower as well. But the sales volume and the overall number of orders, the intention is that that kind of weights it out. Now, again, there's a number of different factors as to why you'd make one of these two decisions. Um, Ideally, in both positions, you're first order profitable, or at least if you have some sort of recurring component to a purchase of your product, that it's within a reasonable period of time. Because if you're waiting maybe 3 months for somebody to reorder, that might be fine, but there's a cash flow implication in between those 3 months that you need to consider. So oftentimes people will, won't be in a position, not even to be unfair about it. There's obviously dynamics that make this very difficult. They're not in a
Hmm.
position to really make a just throw one or the other out. It's oftentimes a balance between that maximize absolute profitability and maximizing the sales volume. But again, either way, it's about saying, okay, maybe what's the CPA, maybe somewhere in the middle. So it's not very low, but it's not getting too high either. And my customer contribution margin, I'm making a choice that on a per order basis it won't be maybe as high as it could be, but we're going to set a threshold that it needs to go over. So
So
that's
basically, what
probably a
we're
big one.
we're kind of saying the trade-off is just we're not going to get the volume of sales, but we're going to make sure that the sales that we do get are going to have the margin that we need to kind of make our business. Now, obviously, that's great. It's like, why can't we all do that? But obviously, that trade-off of volume can be difficult for some businesses to sustain because the less volume that we drive through the business, the more of a factor our operational expenses become as well. But it's a nice surefire way to make sure that your CPAs just are not getting out of control as well.
Definitely, yeah. I think ultimately the likes of kind of extra funding, financing, whatever it does, it gives you a longer time horizon. But
Yeah.
I know from my background running the digital marketing agency over the last kind of 8 years before starting StoreHero, we were a bootstrap business, and ultimately, while that meant that we maybe grew more organically, I think it was a real advantage because it's very easy to be disciplined when you don't have any other option. When you
Yeah.
have a specific cash balance, when you're not in a position to say, okay, we have this big float coming from VC investor, loans, whatever the case may be, it allows you to see the wood through the trees and force you to be disciplined. So, whatever your cash flow situation, don't necessarily act like there's a big pile of money in the account or something like that.
Makes a ton of sense. Makes a ton of sense. And one thing I probably just would like to reiterate with everyone is that you can optimize for profitability without needing to actually increase your sales volume. And that might sound ludicrous to everybody, but if you have like One brand I suppose we work with this year may have had slightly bloated operational expense costs, and when we dug into it, probably overspent on their marketing budget. So while the sales volume is actually down this year, the contribution margins of the profit, we'll say after the marketing spend, is up, but the net profit is way up this year on actually a lower sales volume. So instead of just really, I suppose, KPIing yourself and holding yourself to these revenue orientated metrics all of the time, um, if what you're really looking for out of your business is more profit at the end of the day, that doesn't always need to come in the form of driving more and more sales volume through the business. So just
Definitely.
important, I suppose, to look at the distinction between the two there as well.
Yeah, and it's probably an important point even just to jump in and highlight the fact that all the stuff we've been talking about for the last 15 minutes is probably very different than what the typical marketer or business owner or somebody that's
Mm.
looking within Facebook Ads Manager or their Shopify dashboard is using as an indication of the success of their business. Those components are all really important and beneficial, but it's certainly nearly a new language that a lot of people haven't really been exposed to as much because there hasn't been a lot of good resources to really understand that balance between finance and marketing. So all going well, we'll do our part to kind of make that a little bit easier. Maybe just to touch on two other kind of common North Star goals that often can be a factor there for people. Number, it might be new customer acquisition. So again, if you're going to purely maximize sales volume, you're ultimately really, throwing it all at the wall with the intention that you're maximizing sales for today or, this year. But you want to be careful you don't burn your bridges and oversaturate your market for a set of, maybe for next year, let's say. So there's oftentimes a new customer acquisition goal that is in the mix. And for some businesses, it actually might be the priority. So we would always kind of recommend that if it's a case where you're looking to drive new customer acquisition, it's an important component to consider because it gives them future viability to the business. But you're really going to see the effect of that in the form of higher CPAs because, again, those people aren't anyway through the purchase process. And again, this is, you might get some people that are maybe somewhere through that journey at the moment, but in any case, it's going to be a higher source of kind of acquisition in terms from a cost basis. And the other thing is, if you're spending more to acquire that customer, you're going to see a lower contribution margin on the back of it. So again, with all this stuff, I think it's a case of protecting the downside. Understand if you want to acquire new customers as a big focus, as really the North Star, make sure you're, protecting both, okay, how much am I actually willing to spend on my CPA? And then from there, what's the minimum amount of new customer contribution margin or contribution margin on an order basis that I'm willing to actually consider?
Obviously, like it's fine to be negative there, and that it's probably an argument for a lot of brands that
Mm,
it wouldn't really make sense to be profitable on first order. I mean, no, obviously it's very, very dependent on the industry you're operating in. I mean, one brand I used to work with, the Shopify, large UK retailer, would sell sofas. They need to be profitable on first order because you're not replenishing your sofa every month. Whereas another brand I know we're working with it's at StoreHero is selling skincare, so they can almost make sure that they're confident in that they're going to have repeat purchases coming in, more so than the sofa retailer for sure. So it wouldn't make sense. It makes sense obviously for the sofa retailer to make sure that they need to be profitable on first order. But for instance, a brand that has that high repeat rate, they actually might be losing out on future contribution margin by trying to be profitable on the first order. In that, if they actually decided to say, okay, instead of making sure that we're positive contribution on the first order, we're willing to go negative, but we're actually very, very confident that our average customer shops 6 times a year and that we're actually going to be profitable. Even if we double our CPA or our customer acquisition cost, we can be profitable after the second or the third order. But what I would say to brands is if that's an approach that you're going to look at, make sure you're fully dialed in on on that data, and that you're looking at your LTV on a contribution basis because all of a sudden, if your LTV is based on revenue instead of pure profit, you could find yourself looking for those revenue-based finance loans a lot quicker than you might have thought.
definitely. And again, I suppose it's a case of really taking a step back and looking at that trade-off. If you have a
Mm.
€100 average order value or $100 average order value, you're getting a repeat purchase once per quarter. So for the next kind of 12 months, you're looking to, bring in maybe, $400 of LTV on a revenue basis and maybe 200 on a contribution margin basis. That's probably worth paying, Meta, Facebook, Instagram, $100, $120, which technically might mean that, well, definitely would mean that it's a negative kind of contribution margin on that first order. But as you said, protecting the downside, being confident in the fact that you're not making any assumptions around those repurchases on a quarterly basis. And if you do have that kind of longer sales cycle, or I suppose profitability cycle, maybe even say, then that you have the financing to support it. If you're not sure, it's probably an indication that you might not. And again, better to play it safe than anything else. So I suppose the other component there, maybe to touch on the kind of fourth key North Star metric that we would often see as a goal, I should say. So not only we've absolute profitability, sales volume, new customer acquisition, but also clearing an existing inventory. This is much more of a practical consideration. For those three, we can be having all these hypothetical conversations around, okay, do we want to acquire new customers? Do we want to be profitable or not? There's certain retailers sitting there with a large stock and amount of inventory, and it's not moving, or it needs to move by a certain period of time. Whether it's because it's aging stock, it's perishable goods, it's because you've kind of replenished stock coming in, older product lines, whatever the case may be, there's a practical implication of that sitting there that you need to take more direct action on. So in those situations in which you are looking to clear an existing inventory, you're going to need to kind of expect that your CPA is going to be higher. So it's maybe not as high as maybe if you're acquiring new customers, but you're certainly not going to be bottom of the barrel in terms of CPA and the costs associated there. And then from there, again, the practical implication is you're going to have a slightly lower contribution margin average on a per order basis. So another, again, a practical one, but an important one.
Definitely. And I mean, yeah, there's a time and a place for just saying, okay, the gig is up with this product. We need to just clear it and turn the inventory back into cash, because obviously we want to make sure if we're doing discounts that they're out there for a reason. And obviously we want to make sure that they're kind of strategically aligned with the business goals. And if we have aged stock just sitting there, it's tying up cash. Are we really going to move it at the price that we wanted to move it at? Maybe it's just a lesson learned for the business, and we need to reduce it, turn it back into cash, and just put it to work again.
Definitely. I think it's ultimately the opposite of what you would consider kind of best in class when it comes to inventory. And that's probably even an unfair bar to hold a lot of businesses to, but getting to that negative cash conversion cycle where your business model allows for the fact that you can actually avoid or delay payment on your goods until after those sales are already in the Shopify order screen or in the StoreHero orders tab with the extra profitability data. Nice to
I think
say, but not as practical.
I think we'll need to do a whole episode on negative cash conversion cycle at some stage, but it's it's a really really important point. But I think that one probably deserves its own episode at some stage.
Definitely.
But yeah, in terms of, I suppose we've looked at kind of some of the North Star goals. Ugh.
Too many tongue to Americans.
I know, way too much. In terms of key metrics that you're looking at, talk to me. What are you looking at, or what do you advise people to be looking at coming into Q4?
Sure, definitely, yes. So ultimately, if it's a case where we define that North Star, the benefit is we can then extrapolate down your full marketing funnel and understand ultimately what does that mean at each stage of the purchase process. So, for example, and across each channel as well, to be honest. So we kind of touched on, the CPA and the contribution margin implication of any of those overarching North Star goals. But if we continue to work back in the funnel from maybe a purchase back to kind of each stage of the website conversion process, we can get an estimate of how much traffic do we need at what kind of conversion rate, assuming the quality of the traffic is coming from channels that are somewhat expected. You have a broad estimation that, okay, my meta traffic converts at a certain amount. It's not a new channel that's going to see my conversion rate really dip. The same process applies within each individual channel that's going to serve traffic onto your website as well. And not only meta, but maybe Klaviyo as a component there, maybe your Google branded search campaigns, maybe it's your Performance Max campaigns. They all play a part in kind of working backwards in the funnel. So if for example, based on that, you want to maximize profitability, let's say, you know what your new customer contribution margin should be, you know how many sales you should expect from repeat customers, from new customers, again, your conversion rates, whatever the individual components are, your average order values from new and repeat customers, get as specific as you can. Ultimately, that's going to give you a much clearer indication that on a daily basis, if you're not hitting that North Star goal, at least kind of the equivalent on a daily basis, it's not a big challenge to try to understand where exactly in the funnel. Is it a conversion rate issue? Is it a new customer issue? Is it a repeat customer issue? Is it a Meta, Google, TikTok issue? It puts you in a much better place to succeed. And I know contribution margin has been one of the components that we've tried to use, and a lot of brands that are really best in class globally are using to try to marry some of those kind of externalities together and get a number that really represents are we growing but doing so profitably. Maybe you can touch on that.
Definitely, yeah. Before we jump in there, I think that the full funnel approach there is such an important one as well. I know we were working with an Australian client earlier in the year where everything was an ads problem and it was a ROAS problem. But when if we think about ROAS, it's really point of measurement on one specific stage of a very, very long journey from finding you to clicking to the website to a product page view to collection page to add to cart, checkout, purchase. Then your ROAS gets measured. It's literally one single point of measurement. And when your brands come to us and say our ROAS isn't good, you really need to, like you've just kind of alluded to there, look at the full funnel. I mean, that Australian client, I think they had it's gone up to a 75% bounce rate this year from a 50% last year. So what they thought was a ROAS problem and a problem with their ads was actually a problem with crappy apps that they'd actually put on their Shopify store and had really slowed it down. They hadn't ran a site speed test. I think it was down around 30 when we checked it on GT metrics. So huge site speed problem as well. So really just to reiterate everything you're saying there, but if you are feeling like there is something going wrong, just making sure that you're looking at it from the top all the way down, because as I said, ROAS is just a point of measurement at literally one small stage of a very, very long funnel. So e-commerce is so dynamic and there's so much things going on websites and stuff like that. They break obviously, but also little pieces of the website can break along the way. So just making sure that if there is something going on, that we're diagnosing up the whole funnel to see if we can pinpoint where the problems are actually really happening, I suppose. Um, yeah, and I suppose coming on to my key metric, I suppose, and one you probably heard me bang on about way too much at this stage, but in contribution margins. So just for anyone who's probably listening who mightn't be 100% sure on what it is, first of all, it's essentially your net sales. So just the really key distinction there is that we're already stripping out our VAT. So we're not looking at the total sales figure that you might see in your Shopify dashboard. We are stripping out VAT, and then we're pulling out all of the cost of goods. So yes, we're pulling out your product costs, but we also want to make sure that we're pulling out your transaction fees, or your shipping costs, not just your shipping sales. Obviously, the distinction there is your free shipping threshold. Your transaction fees, any cost to return items or exchange them, all of those full blended cost of goods are fully loaded COGS, I suppose, as we see it kind of called nowadays as well. So we're starting off with the net sales minus our fully loaded COGS, and then we're also pulling out all of our marketing spend. So really what we're saying here is in the last couple of years, obviously post iOS 14, it's got much trickier to attribute confidently in Facebook or Google. We've all probably been there. You log into Facebook, you see you've done 50 grand this month in revenue. Google tells you you've done 50 grand in revenue. And then you log into Shopify and you look at last month and it says 75. So once that's happened, it's become, I suppose, it undermines brands' confidence in trusting what Facebook and Google can say. But what I suppose contribution margin does is it's almost this holy grail metric that does enable you to really track the effectiveness of your ad spend. So like if we've gone from increasing our ad spend, if we've doubled it this month, has our absolute profit after marketing spend, obviously including that increase in the marketing spend, has that gone up? If it has gone up, what we'd really be saying is you should probably continue to incrementally look to increase that ad budgets to a point where you kind of meet that point of diminishing marginal returns, whereby you get to a point where, okay, you've dialed up ad spend enough that your revenue probably has gone up, but your profit after marketing has either not gone up or it's actually started to decline. And that's where probably, I suppose, the beauty of it is that you want to try and get away from seeing, like, if you weren't looking at contribution margin, you might see, okay, we put more ad dollars into Facebook or Google, our revenue has gone up, let's keep spending. But with the contribution margin, you actually realize that you've kind of got to that point of diminishing marginal returns, whereby any extra dollars or euros or pounds or whatever it is that you're spending, any extra spend in Facebook or Google isn't actually any better off for me. My sales actually could be gone up, but what I actually have left at the end of the day is worsening, because it's not as efficient as the ad dollars that have gone before it. So just to kind of touch on why I suppose contribution margin is that important. And just to, I suppose, one other thing before we jump off that is that it's probably the biggest shift I've seen in e-commerce this year, to be perfectly honest with you. I grew up with e-commerce at home. My mom had an e-commerce business for 20 years, and I was probably working to this figure called contribution margin for a long time without really realizing what it was actually called up until maybe 2 or 3 years ago. And it's been a huge shift this year. I think we saw the buzz around attribution in 2021. That seems to be replaced by contribution margin this year. I think as attribution continually becomes as subjective and difficult to really ascertain if it's true or not. Contribution obviously margin cannot lie to us, and we're probably seeing the best brands working off this, and the best agencies that are now educating the brands that they're working with on how to align on contribution margin, because I suppose it definitely is a mutually beneficial metric for brands to be operating on with their agency. It can be scary for a brand to tell an agency, we're okay with you doubling our ad budget, but if you're both purely aligned on that profit figure, it absolutely makes sense for the brand to keep giving the agency as much money as possible, as long as they can justify that it's within the business's best interest.
Yeah, it's an interesting one. Like, I would think in a couple of years, people are going to really, and to be honest, like, we're obviously biased in this and we're making a decision to really focus our time on building something with this as the thesis. But, you know, I could easily see a scenario in a couple of years where people look back and say, Jeez, it was so hard to run an e-commerce business, making decisions on revenue metrics and then waiting a couple of weeks to chat to the accountant to figure out the implication of all these costs. And I think contribution margin is one of the first metrics that really, again, you know, people who are operating at a really high level globally in the direct to consumer space really get it. And it's, I suppose, something we want to pick up on as something to give to users and give to brands in a format that they can actually effectively use on a daily basis without needing to be buried in spreadsheets for hours every day.
The one thing I would add to that is that yes, I think you are right, and I think that would probably though specifically kind of have a narrow time frame in terms of 2022 and 23, where I think before 2022, your ad costs were so efficient in that
True.
you actually could have had your agency not understand finances. And by the way, we're not asking any agencies out there to become accountants, but they do now need to be able to speak finance to some degree in terms of how to talk about margins and profitability. But on the flip side of that, you had your accountant or your financing team who definitely did not want to speak marketing. And that was fine, and that was kind of masked by the fact that you actually probably didn't need to be a genius marketer prior to iOS 14 to actually knock it out of the park on Facebook or Google, and that if you had a decent product and your website was well optimized, as long as you knew how to properly run your Facebook ad account, you actually didn't really need to think about the margins too much, because the return was so strong for everyone largely across the board that it didn't matter too much. But I think what we're really seeing across the board is that as these ad costs continue to get more and more expensive, and as inflation is just driving the cost of business up continually across the board, is that those two functions between marketing and finance, I think now for the first time, like I've seen this at the top level of a lot of Shopify stores for a long time, but I think it's now coming down to every store now needs to get that link between how their finances interact with their marketing, and definitely how their marketing interacts with their finance, because connecting those two, I think, is almost a superpower for e-commerce brands today, and will be required, I think, to really succeed over the next couple of years.
Definitely. And I think, I suppose, this Black Friday and Cyber Monday and kind of Christmas period is really again, for all the kind of key points we've mentioned today, is really an opportunity for people to double down on this kind of stuff. Needing to be more aware of it by nature of the fact that this is a period in which they're going to invest additional spend, and therefore there's a bigger pressure to make sure you have your numbers dialed in and you have a sense of what those boundaries are. What's my minimum spends? What's my maximum spends? What's my minimum margins? My maximum, ideally there's no maximum margins, but in reality there will be on a business by business basis. But maybe just to lead into some kind of other, actionable items before we finish up for brands. So, timing and launching is one component that can often really be a question we're getting. It's a consideration for a lot of businesses, and it's a question I know we're getting. What's your perspective on how people should think about, when that actual Black Friday sale actually kicks off?
Yeah, I mean, we touched on the start of the episode that people are probably scared coming into and excited coming into November. It's the busiest time of the year, but Q4 is a lot bigger than one weekend, and that's one thing I probably would like to really hammer home with everyone here today. In that, yes, obviously plan for Q4, naturally everybody globally now is waiting for that weekend to do their online shopping. So your sales are going to spike regardless of that weekend. Make sure that you want to try and make sure that you're thinking about not just the offer that you're running, but the margin underpinning that, because you could go on a certain level of discounting, knock your sales out of the park, but you could end up being a busy fool and actually not have much left for you at the end of the day. What I'd also say to people as well is that look to try and give offers earlier in the month and after Black Friday. Have them planned now, because in 2 weeks' time you're going to be absolutely swamped and you won't have any time to do any of this thinking that will really, really pay dividends. So think about, people are going to be in shopping mode from here on in. We just had Halloween last week, and people are really going to be in shopping mode from here on in. So having some kind of offers live on your website, even if they're not your Black Friday offers for the next couple of weeks, and have them changing, I think is going to be really, really important. A nice little exercise that I've been kind of doing with some of the clients over the last month has been almost breaking down from the 1st of November to the end of December in 5 week blocks, 5 day blocks, and actually seeing, okay, last year, what percentage of your revenue for the 8 week block came in those kind of time periods, and just seeing how did that match up with your ad spend. Did What percentage of your ad spend was spent when in those 5 blocks, and what percentage of your revenue came in those blocks, and did they align? Because well, you could actually end up seeing, I know one client, I think only 3% of their revenue over the 8 weeks came in the first week or two of November, which is very much prime shopping season. Like
Well,
obviously it's not Black Friday, but holding off all of your marketing or all of your promo for the last weekend of the month, I don't think is going to be a runner this year. I think probably the reason for that as well is that the consumer, everyone has less money in their pocket this year, I think, as well, and that every brand is probably going to go a little bit earlier this year, and that if you are looking to compete with your competitors and they go earlier, I know you were actually touching on this before we came on. You might want to just take that away there, actually.
yeah, it's an interesting one. Like, there's a practical implication, I suppose, if people only have a certain budget to spend. And Moise Ali from Native, I spoke about this on a podcast I was listening to. If they've only a certain budget there to spend on gifts and maybe for others and for themselves around the Black Friday period, and someone gets in front of them earlier, that budget could be gone. So there's a practical component there to see what are your competitors doing. Be reactive by nature of the fact that if you're more prepared, you're more in a position to be reactive and get your campaigns live a little bit earlier than maybe you anticipated. So it's a luxury, but it's a necessary luxury, I suppose, in terms of a position to be in, to have those assets ready to go, even if it's a couple of days earlier. That may make a bigger difference than you might initially perceive, not only for the sake of those couple of days of revenue or day or two of revenue, but more so specifically, where are you in people's mind frame? Is there capacity for people to fit your product to your industry and your kind of product catalog within their budget? So definitely a big piece to consider. And so it's very tied to that. I think the get discounting and approach to discounting would be a big consideration there. As to if you're going to extend that time period, you want to make sure your discounting is smart and is intelligent, as compared to maybe a couple of years ago where this was a 24 to 72 hour block. You could maybe afford to give very aggressive discounts because it was a more concentrated time of the year. It represented 1% of the kind of the split of the year in terms of kind of days and hours of sale. Now practically that's has changed, but oftentimes the discounting hasn't, because you still have that competitive pressure. Now again, it's all well and good to keep up with the Joneses, but if you're not in a position to actually make any profit at the end of the day because you've been way too aggressive with your discounting, then who's actually won? There's sales there where maybe you actually were better off not getting, because it's actually moved you backwards towards your goals if profitability's been any sort of consideration. I know you've been talking to a lot of brands about this.
Yeah, I mean, one thing I would say there is that, like, when you're building your discounting strategy or whatever kind of discounts you're going to run for Black Friday, is thinking about who's incentivized to hit the KPI and what is the KPI. Is it CPA? Like that's typically one a lot of brands work with their agency on, with is to, okay, we want to hit this CPA for this product, and if we hit this, this is good. But it goes without saying, but it probably needs to be said, is that if you're going into Black Friday and you're planning to put in a 20% discount, that target CPA does need to change as well, because you're now trying to get an order for X dollars or X euros, but the X euros that you're actually getting from the sale have been now reduced by 20%. So your CPA needs to kind of move accordingly. Maybe not directly in tandem, because once you do introduce some kind of discount, you will incur a higher sales volume as well. So maybe they don't need to meet exactly, but as your sale gets introduced, if you have a target CPA set, you will need to adjust that accordingly to some degree as well. So yeah, I mean, there's often different ways of looking at your discounting between percentage versus fixed. What I typically say to people is, if you're doing it on a product, do whatever sounds bigger. So if you're offering if you have a $50 AOV and you're offering a 20% discount, 20% sounds better than $10. So kind of often pick whatever sounds better in that case. Obviously, one really, really common tactic we see used with a lot of brands is the up to 70% sale off. And when you click in, it's the clearance items. Nothing wrong with that. I think it works really, really well for a lot of brands. So it's definitely one that I would encourage brands to keep an eye on. Always gets a few eyeballs on subject lines going out as well. Last discount, I suppose, just from my side anyway, that it can be really, really used effectively. But also, I've seen a lot of brands hemorrhage a lot of their margin is on the free shipping threshold. Um, Obviously, a lot of e-commerce brands, probably most, I would say at this stage, have some kind of free shipping threshold. Um, a good rule of thumb I've seen in the past, obviously very, very industry dependent and probably country dependent, has been to set your free shipping threshold at about 20% over your average order value. So if, just for instance, if you were a brand and you had your free shipping threshold, if you were a brand with an average order value of $50, and then your shipping was $5 to ship as well, um, every customer that comes in and orders for $50, they're now going to get free shipping of $5. They might have also got a welcome 10 discount of 10% off. So you actually might be on a 20% sale without realizing it at all. So just be very, very mindful that your free shipping threshold is a discount, and just make sure that depending on the margin that you actually have available to you, are you aware of that and are you using it effectively? Because if you're not, it could be killing your margin at the end of the day, because um, if you're trying to make $5 or $10 on an order, after contribution, after you take into account your marketing spend, you could almost double it by just having your free shipping threshold pushed a little bit higher. Now, obviously, that will have some knock-on effect, a small bit, to your conversion rate as well, but it's just I suppose, a discount that I often see people not really refer to as a discount. Obviously, it's free for the customer. It's definitely not free for you as the business owner.
Yeah, it's one that people often overlook because it's one of those things that's been set up on the site. It's there in the background, and it's ultimately not even maybe a consideration, especially for marketing. It's more of an
Yeah.
e-com operations decision at that point because it's so integrated within the business. So such an important point. One last one, maybe to finish up, I think is free gifting. It's something we've seen brands take advantage of to a really large extent, and it can
Mm.
be really powerful for a couple of reasons. So number one, if you're driving new customer acquisition, brands maybe, or sorry, customers may not actually have a perceived value of your product. So 20% off something that they didn't know what it cost or didn't assign a value to the product before might not actually mean as much to them. And maybe even 20% might capture attention, but anything on a 10 to 15% basis may not be enough to really capture their attention. With the free gift, ultimately you're positioning the saving as the value, the RRP of that product, whereas that's going to be different from the product costs that you actually incur. You're already paying for the shipping. It's already factored into the order. Again, you might ideally kind of use a free gift in addition to maybe a certain kind of spend, which can be really powerful. You could end up, focusing on a free gift with maybe 50, 60, 70% margin. The customer is delighted because there's actually something tangible they're getting, and you're in a better position as well because, it's not actually given as much in terms of nominal value. I think that can be really powerful as well because let's say, for example, you have a free gift which might cost you €5 or $5, and maybe actually two or three, let's say $2 or $3, just for argument's sake. Um, Oftentimes people actually completely cancel out the gift because their CPA might drop by two, three, or $5. So even if it's a case where customers spend the exact same amount of money, the incentive in your kind of social ads has meant that you're acquiring customers more cost effectively, and you're net positive even without that as well. So that's one that definitely worth considering, especially through all the kind of lens here.
One final thought, I suppose, from my side is just for brands to get a hold of their contribution margin, make sure that it's in line, see how you're trending last year for November and December, have a look at how efficient your ad spend actually was coming into November and December, maybe compared to September and October last year. And just see kind of how you can map that into your promotional strategy for Q4 as well. Understand how do we map that into maybe looking at our marketing budgets and our discounting strategy for Q4 as well.
100% well said. Yeah, hopefully everyone likes these videos, and we'll go to clip this up and hopefully get some more bite-sized content that people can see in their feeds and get some value out of as well. For those who hung around for the 45 minutes, much appreciated. A lot of weight in here and a lot of specifics that all going well. There's a lot of substance there if we do our job right, and we'll definitely improve as we go. So if there's anything you'd like to see more of, do let us know. Also, would recommend downloading our ebook, our Profit First Guide to E-commerce, which actually gives a really comprehensive view of all of this stuff in much nicer, succinct language than we probably have done today. So, yeah. Any other questions? Let us know, and yeah, hopefully see you guys soon.